My name is Danny Rodriguez, and I need to tell you about my time working the night shift at Walmart in Cedar Falls. I'm not working there anymore. I'll explain why later. But I need someone to know what really goes on in that store after the sun goes down. Maybe it'll help the next guy who takes the job. Maybe it'll just help me sleep better at night. Either way, this story needs to be told. I started working there 3 months ago, back in June. I dropped out of college after my sophomore year. Student loans were crushing me, and I wasn't really sure what I wanted to study anyway. The night shift at Walmart paid a couple dollars more per hour than day shift, and since I've always been a night owl, it seemed like easy money. Stock shelves, help the occasional customer, clean up a bit. How hard could it be? The store itself is pretty new, built in 2018 on the site of some old textile factory that burned down back in the 1970s. It's your standard 24-hour Walmart. Bright, fluorescent lights, wide aisles, and that particular smell that all big box stores seem to have. During the day, it's packed with families and senior citizens getting their weekly shopping done. But at night, it's a completely different place. My first 2 shifts were training shifts with Jerry, the guy I was replacing. Jerry was in his 50s, had worked night shift for about 8 years, and seemed eager to move to day shift. Really eager, like suspiciously eager. When I asked him why he was switching after so long, he just shrugged and said the night shift wasn't agreeing with him anymore. He taught me the basics, how to use the inventory system, where all the cleaning supplies were kept, the general routine of stocking and maintaining the store overnight. But Jerry never mentioned the rules. It wasn't until my 3rd shift, my first night completely alone, that I learned about them. Mrs. Patterson, the night manager, had been working late finishing up some paperwork when she handed me a laminated sheet of paper right before she left at 11. "Danny," she said, her voice unusually serious, "I need you to read this carefully and follow it exactly. No exceptions, no questions. Corporate policy requires strict adherence to these guidelines for insurance purposes." Insurance purposes. That's what she said. I should have known then that it was bullshit, but I was new and didn't want to rock the boat. I took the sheet and glanced at it as she gathered her things. "Mrs. Patterson," I called after her as she headed for the exit. "Some of these seem kind of weird. Are you sure this is right?" She stopped walking and turned back to me, and I'll never forget the look on her face. It was deadly serious, almost scared. "Danny, I've been managing night shifts at retail stores for 15 years. I've seen what happens when people don't follow the rules. Just do exactly what that paper says, and you'll be fine. Break any of those rules, and..." She paused, looking around the empty store. "Well, let's just say the last guy who worked your shift quit after 2 weeks because he couldn't handle what happened when he got curious." With that cheerful thought, she left me alone in the store with my list of rules. I sat down behind the customer service desk and read through them properly for the first time. Night shift. Employee guidelines. Cedar Falls location. Never acknowledge customers who enter between 2 and 4 wearing all white clothing. If the automatic doors open and close repeatedly with no one there, prop them open for exactly 13 minutes. Clean up any spills in aisle 7 immediately, no matter what time it is. If you hear children laughing in the toy section after midnight, do not investigate. The employee break room door must remain locked between 1 and 5. Never count the security cameras. There should always be one more than you remember. If a customer asks for help finding the old entrance, direct them to the pharmacy section and walk away. Stock the baby formula section last and never alone. If the lights flicker in grocery, immediately move to electronics until they stop. The cleaning closet in the back stockroom is off limits during night shifts. At the bottom of the page, in smaller print, violation of any of these guidelines may result in immediate termination and forfeiture of all benefits. Report any unusual incidents to day management only. I read through the list 3 times, trying to make sense of it. Most of it seemed harmless enough, maybe a little odd, but nothing that would be difficult to follow. The first rule was the weirdest, but I figured maybe they'd had problems with shoplifters or something, and that was their way of handling it. The security camera thing seemed like typical corporate paranoia about employees slacking off. It was the casual mention of children laughing after midnight that gave me pause. What children? The store was closed to anyone under 18 after 10 o'clock. It was posted right on the front doors, but I shrugged it off and tucked the rules into my back pocket. How bad could it be? The first week went smoothly enough. I fell into a routine pretty quickly. Spend the first couple hours restocking the shelves that had been picked over during the day. Do a cleaning sweep around 1 o'clock, then work on the larger projects like reorganizing displays or deep cleaning sections of the store. The overnight customers were few and far between. Mostly people getting off late shifts themselves, grabbing milk or diapers or whatever they'd forgotten to pick up earlier. It was on my 4th night that I encountered my first rule situation. I was restocking the shampoo aisle around 2:30 when I heard the automatic doors whoosh open. I looked up toward the front of the store and saw a woman walking in. She was maybe in her 40s, average height, with shoulder-length brown hair. Nothing unusual about her except for one thing. She was dressed entirely in white. White dress, white shoes, white purse. Even her nail polish was white. My first instinct was to call out a greeting, maybe ask if she needed help finding anything. That's what I had been doing with every other customer. But the rules were fresh in my mind, and something about her made me hesitate. She moved differently than other customers, too purposefully, like she knew exactly where she was going, despite the fact that she kept looking around like she'd never been in the store before. So I followed rule number 1. I ignored her completely. It was harder than you might think. For the next hour, I could hear her moving through the store, the squeak of her cartwheels, the soft tap of her shoes on the linoleum, the occasional rustle as she picked items off the shelves. A few times, I caught glimpses of her in my peripheral vision as I worked, but I kept my head down and focused on my tasks. The weird thing was the items she was putting in her cart. I couldn't see them clearly. Remember, I wasn't supposed to be looking at her, but what I could see didn't make sense. One looked like an old-fashioned glass milk bottle, the kind they stopped using in grocery stores decades ago. Another looked like a box of cereal, but the graphics on it were all wrong, like it was designed in the 1980s. She left around 3:30, and I didn't hear the automatic doors chime when she went out. 1 minute, I could hear her cart squeaking near the pharmacy section, and the next minute, the store was silent again. I walked up to the front to make sure she was gone, and there was no sign she'd ever been there. No receipt at the self-checkout. No items left behind. Nothing. But I followed the rule, and nothing bad happened. I was starting to think maybe this night shift thing wouldn't be so difficult after all. I was wrong. The second rule situation happened 2 nights later. I was mopping the floors near the entrance around midnight when the automatic doors started acting up. Open, close, open, close, over and over again with nobody anywhere near them. I stood there watching for a minute, wondering if it was some kind of malfunction, when I remembered rule number 2. I propped the doors open with the rubber door stops that were kept behind the customer service counter. Apparently, this had happened enough times that they kept the tools handy. As soon as the doors were propped open, the malfunction stopped, but something else started. The temperature dropped. Not gradually, immediately, like someone had cranked the air conditioning to maximum. My breath started fogging, and I could see goosebumps forming on my arms. But it wasn't just cold air coming from outside. It was something else. Something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. And then I heard the sound. It was faint at first, like it was coming from very far away or from deep underground. A rhythmic, mechanical sound. Clunk, hiss, clunk, hiss. Like old machinery running. Factory machinery, maybe. The kind of heavy industrial equipment that would have been running in the textile factory that used to occupy this site. I checked my watch and started timing. 13 minutes felt like an eternity, while that sound got louder and the temperature got colder. By the time I removed the doorstops, my teeth were chattering, and the mechanical sounds seemed to be coming from directly beneath my feet. But as soon as the doors closed and resumed their normal function, everything went back to normal. The temperature returned to comfortable, and the sound stopped immediately. I made a mental note to bring a jacket to work. The children's laughter happened on my 6th night. I was working in the household goods section around 1:15 when I heard it, high-pitched giggles coming from the toy section on the other side of the store. At first, I thought maybe it was coming from outside or from one of the displays that had some kind of electronic component. But as I listened, it was definitely the sound of children laughing and playing. Every instinct I had told me to go investigate. What if some kids had snuck into the store and were messing around in the toy aisles? What if someone had left their child unattended and the kid was getting into trouble? But rule number 4 was very clear. Do not investigate. So I stayed put and tried to focus on organizing the shelf of cleaning supplies in front of me. But the laughter continued for almost 20 minutes. Sometimes it was just one child. Sometimes it sounded like several kids playing together. Occasionally, I could swear I heard them talking to each other, but I could never quite make out the words. The worst part was how happy they sounded. It wasn't scary laughter or creepy giggling. It was the sound of children having genuine fun, which somehow made it even more disturbing in the empty store at 1:30 in the morning. When the laughter finally stopped, the silence that followed was deafening. I spent the rest of my shift avoiding the toy section entirely. By the end of my first week, I was starting to understand that there was something genuinely strange about working nights in this particular Walmart. But I needed the job, and honestly, following the rules wasn't that difficult. Weird things happened, but as long as I stuck to the guidelines, I got through my shifts without any real problems. It was during my second week that I started to realize the rules weren't just corporate weirdness, they were protection. Tony Valdez worked the evening shift, 3 to 11, so we overlapped for a few hours each night. He was a good guy, been working at the store for about 2 years, and he seemed to know more about the night shift situation than he let on initially. It took some gentle prodding, but eventually he opened up a bit. "Look, Danny," he said one night as he was getting ready to leave. "I don't know exactly what goes on here after I clock out, but I know it's not normal. The guy you replaced, Kevin, he lasted exactly 2 weeks before he quit. Didn't give notice, didn't finish his last shift, just walked out halfway through a Tuesday night and never came back." "What happened?" I asked. Tony glanced around the store, even though we were alone. Kevin was curious, asked a lot of questions about those rules Mrs. Patterson gave you, started testing boundaries. Whatever he saw or experienced that last night, it was enough to make him quit a job he really needed. He paused. Kevin had 3 kids and a mortgage. You don't walk away from steady work unless something's seriously wrong. Did he ever tell you what he saw? He tried to. Called me the next day, said he needed to talk to someone who'd understand. We met for coffee, and he started telling me about things that happened during his shifts. But honestly, Danny, the stuff he was saying was so crazy that I thought maybe the stress of working nights was getting to him. People working alone for hours can start imagining things. Tony gathered up his things and headed for the time clock. "Just follow the rules, man. Don't get curious. Do your job and go home." But Tony's warning only made me more aware of the strange things happening around me. The woman in white started showing up more frequently, 2 or 3 times a week, always between 2 and 4. I got better at ignoring her, but I started noticing more details despite myself. She always pushed the same shopping cart, an older model with one squeaky wheel. The items in her cart kept changing, but they were always things that looked out of place, like they belonged in a different time period. One night, I caught a glimpse of what looked like an old rotary phone in her cart. Another night, it was a manual typewriter. Old stuff. Stuff that wouldn't have been sold in a Walmart built in 2018. The spill situation in aisle 7 became a nightly occurrence. Every night around 3:30, I'd find a dark liquid spilled across the floor in exactly the same spot. It wasn't water. It was thicker, almost syrupy, and it had a metallic smell that reminded me of old pennies. The first few times, I figured maybe there was a leak in the ceiling or something was dripping from a higher shelf. But there was nothing above that spot that could have caused a spill. The liquid was also weird in other ways. It seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. When I shined my flashlight on it, the beam seemed to get swallowed up, making the spill look like a dark hole in the floor. And no matter how thoroughly I cleaned it up, mopping, scrubbing, even using bleach, it would be back the next night in the exact same spot. The automatic door situation started happening more frequently too. Some nights, the doors would malfunction 2 or 3 times per shift. I got used to keeping the doorstops handy, but those 13-minute intervals never got less uncomfortable. The temperature drop was always severe, and the mechanical sounds from beneath the store got louder each time. Sometimes I could swear I heard voices mixed in with the machinery sounds. People talking in what sounded like a different language, or maybe just voices distorted by distance and interference. But the most unsettling development was what happened with the employee break room. I'd been following rule number 5 religiously, making sure the break room stayed locked between 1 and 5. But one night during my 3rd week, I made a mistake. I'd been cleaning the employee bathroom around 2:45 and forgot what time it was. The break room was just down the hall and I was thirsty. Without thinking, I walked over and reached for the door handle. That's when I heard the voices. There were people inside the break room, multiple people having a quiet conversation. I could hear the murmur of voices, the scrape of chairs against the floor, the soft ding of a microwave. It sounded like a normal break room during a busy shift, except I was the only employee in the building. I froze with my hand on the door handle, listening. The voices were too quiet to make out individual words, but they sounded like people discussing work, the casual, tired conversation of employees on a break. Someone laughed quietly. Someone else sighed. Then, as if they'd somehow sensed my presence, the conversation stopped. Complete silence. After a few seconds, I heard the scrape of multiple chairs moving at once, like several people had just stood up. I backed away from the door and didn't return to that hallway until after 5 o'clock that morning. By the beginning of my 4th week, I was starting to understand that the Walmart had 2 different realities. There was the daytime reality, normal customers, normal operations, normal retail environment. And there was the nighttime reality, where things that shouldn't exist continued to operate in the spaces between what was supposed to be there. But understanding didn't make it less unsettling. If anything, it made it worse, because I was starting to realize that the rules weren't just guidelines. They were containment protocols. They were designed to keep 2 different worlds from fully intersecting. And I was getting curious about what would happen if they did. That curiosity almost got me in serious trouble. It started small. During a quiet period one night, I decided to test rule number 6 about the security cameras. I'd been wondering about that one since my first shift. What did it mean that there should always be one more than I remember? I started in electronics, counting the cameras I could see from behind the counter. There was one above the entrance to electronics, one covering the mobile phone display, one watching the video game cases, and one positioned to cover the general merchandise aisles. 4 cameras. I moved to grocery and counted again. 2 cameras covering the produce section, one at the end of each major aisle, one above the pharmacy counter. I counted carefully, making sure not to miss any. 12 cameras in the grocery section. Then I went to the front of the store and counted the cameras covering the checkout areas, customer service, and entrance. 8 cameras. So far, so good. 4 plus 12 plus 8 equals 24 cameras total. I made a mental note and continued with my regular duties. About an hour later, during another quiet period, I decided to count again, just to make sure I'd gotten it right the first time. I started with electronics again. The same 4 cameras were there, but now I noticed a 5th one tucked into a corner I hadn't seen before. How had I missed that one? The grocery section now had 13 cameras. I counted 3 times to make sure. There was definitely one more than I had counted before. A camera positioned above the dairy section that I was certain hadn't been there during my first count. The front of the store still had 8 cameras, but one of them was in a slightly different position than I remembered. 25 cameras total, one more than my first count. I decided to count one more time, just to see what would happen. Third count, 26 cameras. This time, I found cameras in positions that definitely hadn't been there before. One covering an aisle from an angle that would have been impossible given the ceiling structure. Another positioned in a spot where there was no mounting bracket. I stopped counting after that. But for the rest of my shift, I had the uncomfortable feeling that I was being watched from angles that shouldn't exist. Sometimes, when I turned quickly, I'd catch a glimpse of a camera in my peripheral vision. But when I looked directly at it, there was nothing there. A few nights later, my curiosity got the better of me again. This time, it was the children's laughter that broke my resolve. It started around 12:45, the familiar sound of kids playing in the toy section. But this time, it went on longer than usual. After 30 minutes of listening to invisible children having what sounded like a fantastic time, I couldn't stand it anymore. I walked quietly toward the toy section, telling myself I'd just take a quick look from the end of the aisle. I wouldn't actually investigate. I'd just satisfy my curiosity enough to get back to work. As I got closer, the laughter got clearer. I could definitely distinguish between different children's voices now. At least 3 kids, maybe 4. They seemed to be playing some kind of game that involved running around and hiding from each other. When I reached the end of the toy aisle and looked down it, the laughter stopped immediately. The aisle was empty, of course, but something was wrong with the toys. Every single doll on the shelves had been turned to face the same direction. Baby dolls, fashion dolls, action figures, all of them were positioned to look directly toward the back of the store, toward the employee-only areas. It was like an army of tiny plastic eyes, all focused on the same target. I stood there for a minute, trying to process what I was seeing. The dolls had definitely not been arranged that way during my last walk through the section. Someone, or something, had deliberately turned them all around. As I watched, I could swear I saw one of the dolls shift slightly, like it was trying to get a better look at something behind me. I spun around, but the main aisle was empty. When I turned back to the toy section, all the dolls had returned to their normal positions, facing forward on the shelves like nothing had happened. I didn't go back to the toy section for the rest of that shift. But my most serious rule violation happened during my 5th week, and it involved rule number 7, the one about customers asking for the old entrance. I was restocking the pharmacy section around 3 when an elderly man approached me. He was probably in his 70s, wearing faded work clothes and a baseball cap. Nothing unusual about him except for the way he moved, like he was familiar with the store layout, but kept getting confused by things being in the wrong places. "Excuse me, son," he said. "Can you help me find the old entrance?" According to the rule, I was supposed to direct him to the pharmacy section and walk away. But we were already in the pharmacy section, and something about his question made me curious. "The old entrance?" I asked. "What do you mean?" The man looked around, his expression puzzled. "The employee entrance used to be right around here somewhere. We'd come in through the back when our shift started, clock in at the time station by the supervisor's office, "I'm sorry, sir, but this is a Walmart. There's no employee entrance back here and no supervisor's office. Are you maybe thinking of a different store?" The man stared at me like I'd said something crazy. "Different store? Son, I worked in this building for 32 years. Started here when I was 18, worked my way up to floor supervisor. I know every inch of this place." Something cold settled in my stomach. "Sir, this building has only been here since 2018. Before that, there was a textile factory on this site, but it burned down in the 1970s. The man's face went pale. "Burned down?" He looked around the pharmacy section with growing confusion. "But that's not right. We were just working. It was just a normal Tuesday. Johnson was running the big loom in Section 3. Henderson was working the dye vats. Maria was doing quality control." He trailed off, looking lost. "What's your name?" I asked gently. Walter Fleming. I'm the floor supervisor for the night shift." He paused. "At least, I was." "What year did you say this was?" I told him and watched his face crumble. "That can't be right," he whispered. That would mean it's been 50 years." Walter started walking toward the back wall of the pharmacy section, moving like he was following a familiar path. "The entrance was right here," he said, placing his hand on the wall. "There was a door here. A heavy metal door with a push bar. The time clock was just inside, mounted on the wall next to the bulletin board where they posted the shift assignments. I followed him, and as I watched, I realized something strange. The paint on the wall where he was touching it looked slightly different from the rest of the wall. Newer, like it had been painted over something. And when Walter pressed his palm against it, I could swear the wall felt warm. "Walter," I said carefully, "what happened the night the factory burned?" He turned to look at me, and for the first time, his eyes seemed fully focused. "There was an accident in Section 4. One of the new guys, I can't remember his name, was working alone on the big press. Something went wrong, and he got caught in the machinery. We heard him screaming, but by the time we got there, he shuddered. There was so much blood. And then the electrical system overloaded. Sparks everywhere. The whole place went up in minutes. What happened to the workers who were there that night?" Walter's expression grew distant again. "I don't know. I remember the sirens, the fire trucks. Everything was so bright and hot and loud. And then," he frowned, "I don't remember leaving. I just remember showing up for my next shift. But everything was different, wrong." As he spoke, I started to hear something, faint at first, but getting louder. The sound of machinery running somewhere behind the wall. The rhythmic clunk hiss that I had been hearing during the automatic door malfunctions, but much clearer now. "Do you hear that?" I asked. Walter smiled for the first time since our conversation started. "The night shift. They're still running the looms. Henderson always said he'd work until they carried him out of here." He pressed both hands against the wall now. "Can you feel it? The whole building still running like it's supposed to." The wall was definitely warm now, and I could feel a slight vibration through the drywall, like heavy machinery operating just on the other side. "Walter," I said, "I think you need to go home now." He looked at me sadly. "I can't go home, son. I'm the supervisor. I have to make sure the night shift gets done. He paused. But maybe it's time to check on the boys in the back. I haven't been to Section 4 in a while. With that, Walter walked away from me, heading not toward the store exit, but toward the back of the building where the stock rooms and employee areas were located. I watched him go, and I could swear he became less solid as he walked, like he was fading into the background. I never saw him again, but for the rest of my shift, I could hear the machinery sounds coming from the back of the store. That night marked a turning point. My rule violations had consequences, and they were starting to accelerate. The woman in white began showing up more frequently, sometimes every night, sometimes multiple times per shift. And she wasn't just shopping anymore. She was watching me, following me around the store, making direct eye contact when I tried to ignore her. The items in her cart became more disturbing. Personal belongings that looked like they'd been recovered from a fire, a charred photo frame, melted plastic toys, pieces of fabric that might have once been clothing. And sometimes she would mouth words at me when I accidentally made eye contact. I couldn't read lips, but the expression on her face was always the same. Help us. The spill in aisle 7 started appearing earlier each shift and took longer to clean up. But worse, I began finding similar spills in other parts of the store, always in places where I'd recently been walking. It was like my presence was somehow causing them to manifest, and they weren't just random puddles anymore. When I looked at them from the right angle, the spills seemed to form shapes. Symbols, maybe, or letters in a language I didn't recognize. I started taking pictures with my phone, thinking maybe I could research them later, but the spills never showed up clearly in photos. The images were always blurry or too dark to make out any details. The automatic doors began their malfunction routine every single night now, sometimes multiple times per shift. During the 13-minute periods when they were propped open, I started seeing figures standing just outside the range of the parking lot lights. They never moved closer to the store, and they never moved away. They just stood there, waiting. One night, I counted 7 figures. Another night, there were 12. They were always wearing work clothes, coveralls, hard hats, safety gear, factory workers, waiting for their shift to start. But the most disturbing development was what was happening with the employee break room. The voices behind the locked door became a constant presence between 1 and 5. Not just quiet conversation anymore, but the full sounds of an active workplace. Phones ringing, papers shuffling, the hum of old computers and machinery. Sometimes I could hear my own name being discussed, always followed by heated arguments that I couldn't quite make out. One night, I heard typing, the distinctive clatter of an old manual typewriter. The rhythm was urgent, like someone was trying to get an important message down on paper as quickly as possible. But every few minutes, the typing would stop, followed by the sound of paper being crumpled up and thrown away. Then the typing would start again. During my 6th week, everything escalated simultaneously. The woman in white brought friends. It started with just one other person, another woman, also dressed entirely in white, who entered the store with her around 2:30. Then it was 3 people, then 5. By the end of the week, a whole group of people in white clothing were entering together during the forbidden hours. They moved through the store like they were shopping for a specific event, a funeral maybe, or some kind of ceremony. They gathered items that flickered between modern products and things that looked like they belonged in a different era. One cart would contain contemporary groceries, but when I looked again, it would be filled with glass bottles and metal cans with labels I didn't recognize. They didn't just ignore me anymore. They actively avoided me, going out of their way to stay in different sections of the store. But I could feel them watching me from a distance, and occasionally I would catch one of them pointing at me while whispering to the others. Meanwhile, the children's laughter in the toy section became a constant background noise. Not just after midnight anymore. It started as soon as my shift began and continued until dawn. The sound followed me throughout the store, always seeming to come from whatever aisle I wasn't currently in. When I finally worked up the courage to check the toy section again, I found that it wasn't just the dolls anymore. Every single toy in the section had been oriented to face toward the back of the store. Board games, stuffed animals, toy cars. Everything was pointed in the same direction, like a compass needle finding magnetic north. And some of the toys seemed to track my movement. I would walk past an aisle, and the toys at the end would shift slightly to follow me with their plastic eyes or painted faces. But the real breakthrough came when I decided to investigate the cleaning closet that was supposedly off limits during night shifts. It was during my 7th week. I'd been following the rules religiously for over a month, but my violations had already weakened whatever barriers were in place. Strange things were happening, whether I followed the rules or not. So I figured I might as well find out what I was really dealing with. The cleaning closet was located in the back stockroom, past the employee break room and the manager's office. It was marked with a simple cleaning supplies placard, and during the day, it was just a normal supply closet. But according to rule number 10, it was off limits during night shifts. I waited until 3 o'clock, the time when the supernatural activity seemed strongest, and walked back to the stockroom with a flashlight and the master key ring Mrs. Patterson had given me. The hallway back there felt different at night, longer somehow, with shadows that seemed too deep for the fluorescent lighting. The employee break room was humming with activity. I could hear at least a dozen people working inside, along with the sounds of machines I couldn't identify. The cleaning closet door looked normal enough. Standard industrial door with a simple lock. But when I put my hand on the doorknob, it felt warm, and I could hear something on the other side. Not the mechanical sounds I'd been hearing elsewhere in the store, but human voices, people talking, calling out to each other over the noise of heavy machinery. I turned the key and opened the door. The space beyond wasn't a closet. It was a factory floor, much larger than should have been possible given the dimensions of the stockroom. The ceiling stretched up into darkness, supported by massive steel beams. Industrial machinery filled the space. Looms, presses, conveyor belts, all of it running at full capacity. The air was thick with the smell of oil and heated metal, and something else I couldn't identify. And there were people working, dozens of them, all wearing the kind of work clothes I'd seen on Walter and the figures in the parking lot. They moved between the machines with practiced efficiency, tending to their equipment, checking gauges, making adjustments. None of them seemed to notice me standing in the doorway. The machinery was loud, a constant roar of industrial activity that should have been audible throughout the entire store. But somehow, it was contained within that impossible space. As soon as I stepped back and closed the door, the sound cut off completely. I opened the door again, and the factory floor was still there, still running, still filled with workers who had been dead for 50 years. One of them, a young man operating a large loom, looked up and saw me watching. He smiled and waved, like he was greeting a co-worker he hadn't seen in a while. Then he gestured toward the far end of the factory floor, where I could see what looked like a supervisor's station. Walter was there, wearing a hard hat and carrying a clipboard, checking on his workers just like he'd been doing for 32 years before the fire killed them all. I closed the door quickly and backed away, but I could still hear the faint sound of machinery running somewhere beneath my feet, and I finally understood what was really happening in the Walmart after dark. The store had been built on the site of the old textile factory, but the factory hadn't been destroyed. It had been displaced, pushed into a space adjacent to normal reality, but still connected to the physical location. The workers who died in the fire were still there, still trying to complete their shifts, still following the routines they'd known in life. And the rules weren't corporate policy. They were containment protocols designed to keep the two realities from fully merging. My violations had weakened the barriers between the worlds. The woman in white and her companions weren't customers. They were the families of the dead workers, still trying to bring them supplies and comfort. The children's laughter was coming from the daycare that the factory had operated for employees' kids. The voices in the break room were modern employees who had violated the rules before me and become trapped in the same liminal space. Everything I'd been experiencing was the result of two different time periods trying to occupy the same physical space, held apart by nothing more than a set of arbitrary seeming rules that some previous night shift employee had figured out through trial and error. And I had been systematically breaking those rules for weeks. The consequences came to a head during my 8th week. It started with the spills. Instead of just appearing in aisle 7, they began manifesting throughout the store. Dark, metallic-smelling puddles that formed symbols I was starting to recognize. They were the same markings I'd seen on some of the machinery in the factory floor behind the cleaning closet door. Warning signs, maybe, or instructions in a language that predated the English signage in the modern store. The symbols seemed to be trying to tell me something, but I couldn't read them. All I knew was that they appeared wherever I walked, like my presence was somehow bleeding the factory reality into the retail space. The automatic doors stopped working entirely. They remained permanently open now, no matter what I did, and the temperature in the store dropped to near freezing every night. The figures in the parking lot moved closer, gathering just outside the entrance, but never quite crossing the threshold. They stood there for hours, waiting for something I didn't understand. But the most terrifying development was what happened to the break room. On Tuesday night of my 8th week, I heard screaming coming from behind the locked door. Not the usual sounds of people working or talking, genuine, panicked screaming. Someone was in serious trouble, and every instinct I had told me to unlock the door and help them. But I remembered what had happened to Kevin, my predecessor, and I forced myself to stay away. The screaming continued for almost an hour. Sometimes it was just one voice, sometimes multiple people, men and women, all of them terrified, all of them begging for help in words I could barely make out through the door. And then, around 3:30, the screaming stopped and was replaced by a new sound, knocking. Someone was pounding on the door from the inside, a desperate rhythm that echoed through the empty store. Then I heard my name. Danny! A man's voice, muffled by the door, but clearly audible. Danny, please, you have to let us out. I approached the door slowly, my hands shaking. Who's in there? It's Kevin. Kevin Porter. I used to work your shift. Please, you have to open the door. Kevin, the guy I'd replaced, the one who'd quit after 2 weeks and never came back. Kevin, how did you get in there? The door's been locked since 1 o'clock. I don't know. His voice was desperate, on the edge of panic. I was working my shift just like normal, and then I was here. Danny, there are other people in here, people who used to work nights. Some of them have been here for years. Other voices joined in, confirming what Kevin was saying. A woman who said she'd worked night shifts in the 1990s. A man who claimed he'd been trapped since 2003. All of them begging me to open the door and let them out. I can't, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The rules say the door has to stay locked. Forget the rules, Kevin shouted. The rules are what got us trapped in here in the first place. You have to break us out. But I remembered Mrs. Patterson's warning about what happened to employees who broke the rules, and I backed away from the door. The voices followed me down the hallway, getting fainter but never completely disappearing. For the rest of my shift, I could hear them calling my name from behind the locked door. By Thursday night, I knew I was in serious trouble. The woman in white and her companions were no longer limiting themselves to the 2 to 4 time window. They were in the store constantly now, moving through the aisles like they owned the place. And they were bringing more people, dozens of figures in white clothing, all of them carrying items that flickered between modern products and things from decades past. They were preparing for something, some kind of event or ceremony that required specific supplies from both time periods, and they were running out of time. The children's laughter had been replaced by children crying. Not the happy sounds of play, but the frightened sobs of kids who were lost and scared and looking for their parents. The toy section had become a gathering place for invisible children who seemed to be waiting for someone to take them home. And the factory sounds from beneath the store were getting louder. During quiet moments, I could hear Walter and his crew working directly below me, their machinery operating at full capacity as they tried to complete whatever production schedule they'd been working on the night they died. The two realities were merging, and I was caught in the middle. Friday night, everything came together. I arrived for my shift to find Mrs. Patterson waiting for me with a sealed envelope and an expression I'd never seen before. Part fear, part resignation, part grim determination. "Danny," she said, "we need to talk." She led me to the customer service desk and handed me the envelope. It was thick, stuffed with papers, and labeled "Emergency Protocols" in red letters. "What is this?" I asked. "The reset procedure," she said. Every few years, someone working night shift gets too curious and weakens the barriers. When that happens, we have to reset everything before the two realities merge completely. Reset how? Mrs. Patterson looked around the store, checking to make sure we were alone. The rules aren't just guidelines, Danny. They're a containment system, but they're not perfect and they're not permanent. When someone breaks too many of them, the system starts to fail. She pointed to the envelope. Those are instructions for a complete reset. It requires one person to work a final shift where they deliberately break every rule in a specific sequence. It's dangerous, and it's not something we ask lightly. What happens to the person who does the reset? I don't know, she admitted. The last employee who did it was before my time. All I know is that it works, and the person who does it doesn't come back to work here afterward. I stared at the envelope, understanding what she was asking. What if I refuse? Then the barriers collapse completely, and Cedar Falls gets a factory that burned down 50 years ago, occupying the same space as a modern Walmart. The living and the dead trying to exist in the same place at the same time. She paused. It's happened before, in other locations. It doesn't end well for anyone. Mrs. Patterson gathered her things and headed for the exit. You don't have to decide tonight, she said, but don't wait too long. The system is failing faster now. After she left, I sat alone in the empty store and opened the envelope. The reset procedure was 12 pages long and incredibly detailed. It involved deliberately triggering every supernatural phenomenon in the store in a specific order, then guiding the displaced entities back to their proper reality. It was part ritual, part technical procedure, and part sacrifice. The person performing the reset had to serve as a bridge between the two worlds, allowing the dead workers and their families to return to the factory floor while helping the trapped modern employees find their way back to normal reality. But the instructions were clear about one thing. The person performing the reset would be changed by the experience. They might survive, but they would never be able to work in the store again. The connection they formed with the other reality would be permanent. I spent the weekend thinking about it. I could quit, like Kevin had, and let someone else deal with the consequences of my rule violations. Or I could take responsibility for what I'd done and try to fix it. Monday night, I made my decision. I arrived for my shift with the reset instructions and a determination to see this through. The store was in chaos. Supernatural activity was happening constantly now, with no regard for the usual patterns or time restrictions. The people in white filled the aisles. The children's crying echoed from every section, and the factory sounds were so loud they seemed to be coming from inside the walls. The reset procedure had to be performed in a specific order, starting with the security cameras and ending with the cleaning closet. Each step required me to deliberately violate a rule while performing a corresponding action that would guide the displaced entities back to where they belonged. I started by counting the security cameras out loud, calling out the numbers as I found each one. 24, 25, 26. With each count, another camera appeared, but instead of feeling watched, I felt like I was opening doorways. Next, I propped open the automatic doors and walked outside to greet the figures in the parking lot. They were Walter's crew, still wearing their work clothes. still carrying their lunch boxes and thermoses. They'd been waiting for someone to invite them back inside. "Your shift is starting," I told them. "Time to clock in." They followed me into the store, walking with purpose toward the back stockroom, where their time clock was waiting. I unlocked the employee break room and opened the door. Kevin and the other trapped employees stumbled out, blinking in the fluorescent light like they hadn't seen it in years. Some of them were confused, unsure how much time had passed. Others seemed to understand immediately what had happened. "Thank you," Kevin said simply, then walked toward the exit without looking back. In the toy section, I called out to the invisible children, telling them their parents were waiting in the factory daycare. The crying stopped, replaced by the sound of running feet as the children hurried toward the back of the store. I acknowledged the woman in white and her companions, helping them gather the supplies they needed for whatever ceremony they were preparing. They smiled gratefully and headed toward the cleaning closet, their carts full of items that existed in both time periods. Finally, I opened the cleaning closet door and stepped onto the factory floor. Walter was waiting for me, still wearing his supervisor's hat and carrying his clipboard. "Been expecting you," he said. "Figured someone would eventually come help us finish up." "Finish what?" "The last production run," Walter explained. "We've been working on it for 50 years, but we could never quite complete it. Needed someone from your side to help coordinate." I spent the rest of my shift working alongside the factory crew, helping them complete whatever project they'd been working on the night they died. I operated machines I'd never seen before, followed instructions I didn't understand, and gradually helped them bring their work to a close. As dawn approached, the factory began to quiet down. Machines stopped running, workers began cleaning up their stations, and Walter made his final rounds to check on everyone. "That's it," he announced. "Shift's over. Everyone did good work tonight." The factory workers began to fade as the morning light grew stronger, not disappearing exactly, but becoming less solid, less present in the physical world. They waved goodbye as they headed toward what looked like an exit that led somewhere I couldn't see. Walter was the last to go. "Thank you," he said, shaking my hand. "We couldn't rest until the work was finished." 50 years is a long shift, even for us. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now we clock out and go home," Walter smiled. "And you do the same." "But Danny..." "Yeah? Don't come back here. This place isn't meant for the living anymore. Find yourself a day job." With that, Walter walked toward the exit and disappeared into the morning light. I closed the cleaning closet door and walked back through the store. Everything was quiet now. No supernatural activity, no strange sounds, no unexplained phenomena. Just a normal Walmart getting ready for the day shift to arrive. I left my name tag on the customer service counter and walked out through the automatic doors. They opened and closed normally behind me, and I never looked back. That was 3 months ago. I found a day job at a hardware store across town, and I've been sleeping much better since then. But sometimes, late at night, I drive past the Walmart just to check on things. The building is still there, still operating normally during the day, but it closes at 10 o'clock now. No more 24-hour service. According to the local newspaper, Corporate decided to change the hours due to insufficient overnight customer traffic. I know better. I know they changed the hours because there's no night shift anymore. The barriers between realities have been restored, but they're fragile. It would be too risky to have employees in the building during the hours when the supernatural activity is strongest. Sometimes, I wonder if anyone else knows the real story of what happened. Mrs. Patterson still works there, but she transferred to day management. Tony moved to a different store across town. The overnight security guard position was eliminated entirely. A few weeks ago, I heard that corporate was planning to tear down the Cedar Falls location and build a new store on a different site. Apparently, they've been having ongoing maintenance issues that make the current building unsuitable for long-term use. I think that's probably for the best. Some places are meant to hold on to their history, and some histories are too heavy for the living to carry. But if you're reading this because you're thinking about taking a night shift job at a 24-hour store, especially one built on the site of an old factory or industrial building, let me give you some advice. Follow the rules, all of them, even the ones that don't make sense. Don't get curious about things that don't concern you. And if you start hearing voices from behind locked doors, or seeing people in white clothes shopping during the forbidden hours, or finding spills that form symbols you don't recognize, quit immediately. Some jobs aren't worth the pay, no matter how much you need the money. Trust me on this one. My name is Danny Rodriguez, and I used to work the night shift at a Walmart in Cedar Falls. I followed the rules, mostly, until I didn't. And I'm one of the lucky ones who got to walk away. Author's note: the Cedar Falls Walmart closed permanently in December 2024. The building was demolished in January 2025, and the site is scheduled to become a public park. According to city records, no unusual incidents occurred during the demolition process. If anyone reading this worked a night shift at that location and has similar experiences to share, I'd be interested in hearing from you. You can reach me through the contact information in my profile. And if you're currently working night shift anywhere and dealing with unexplained phenomena, don't try to handle it alone. Find the rules, follow them, and get help if things start escalating. Some mysteries are better left unsolved.